The ferry, a rust-streaked hulk named the Gray Lady, bucked against the churning Atlantic. Dean leaned against the railing, the cold spray a welcome sting on his face. The wind, sharp and unforgiving, whipped strands of his dark hair across his eyes. He didn't bother to brush them back. He preferred the obscuration, the feeling of the elements pushing back against him. For months, the world had felt too bright, too loud, too much. This island, emerging now from the shroud of fog like a forgotten leviathan, promised a different kind of quiet. He hoped it would swallow him whole. The tragedy that had driven him here was a raw, gaping wound beneath his ribs. He carried it everywhere, a lead weight dragging him down. His estranged grandfather's inheritance, this desolate cottage on a remote rock, felt less like a new beginning and more like a final, desperate retreat. As the ferry cut closer, the island's jagged cliffs became clearer, crowned by the solitary skeletal finger of the lighthouse. Below it, a cluster of buildings clung to the rock face, dwarfed by the sheer scale of the landscape. The ferryman, a burly man with a face weathered by decades of sea wind, nodded curtly as Dean disembarked onto the narrow, barnacle-encrusted dock. No curious faces, no welcoming committee. Just the relentless roar of the surf and the mournful cry of gulls. A single, battered utility vehicle waited, its engine rumbling like a tired beast. "You'd be Dean," the driver said, his voice gravelly, his eyes scanning Dean with an unnerving intensity before settling on the small duffel bag slung over his shoulder. "The cartographer. Your grandfather spoke of you." Dean merely nodded, climbing into the passenger seat. The driver offered no further conversation, navigating the winding, unpaved track that snaked up the island's spine. The road was treacherous, crumbling at the edges, the sea a constant, hungry presence to their left. Dean watched the landscape unfold, a stark, beautiful desolation. He noted the contours, the elevations, the way the ancient rock strata folded upon themselves. An instinct born of his profession, a way to anchor himself in the physical world when his inner world was chaos. He even spotted a distant, lonely structure, a metal framework silhouetted against the gray sky, perched on the highest bluff. A weather station, he surmised, another outpost of human perseverance against the island's raw power. After what felt like an eternity, the vehicle pulled to a halt. It was smaller than he'd imagined, and far more dilapidated. The paint was peeled and blistered, the windows opaque with salt spray and grime. A single gnarled tree, bent almost horizontal by the prevailing winds, clawed at the slate roof. The driver retrieved Dean's duffel bag from the back, placing it on the overgrown patch of grass that served as a lawn. "Keys are under the mat," he stated, his gaze sweeping the cottage with a hint of something unreadable. Pity? Warning? Dean couldn't tell. "Supplies come weekly, same ferry. You'll be fine." "Thank you," Dean managed, his voice a little hoarse. The driver merely grunted, turning the vehicle around and disappearing back down the track, leaving Dean utterly alone. He retrieved the tarnished brass key from beneath a mildewed welcome mat and inserted it into the lock. The mechanism grated, protesting its long disuse, before finally yielding with a metallic click. He pushed open the heavy wooden door. The interior was a study in decay. Dust motes danced in the slivers of weak light filtering through the grimy windows. Furniture, draped in white sheets, stood like ghostly sentinels. He pulled the sheet from a small, rickety table in the main room. He ran a finger through it, leaving a clean streak. It felt old. Not just old in years, but ancient in essence, as if the dust itself held the memory of countless tides and forgotten winds. A faint, almost imperceptible scratching sound reached his ears, seemingly from the walls themselves. He paused, head cocked, listening. The sea, he reasoned. The old house settling. There were always sounds in an old house, yet the scratching seemed to have a rhythm, a subtle insistence that wasn't quite natural. He walked to the nearest window, peering out at the gray expanse of the sea. The fog had begun to roll in thicker now, obscuring the horizon, blurring the line between water and sky. The world outside was dissolving. He turned back to the room, his eyes adjusting to the dim light. He blinked, focusing, but the corner was still, merely a patch of deeper gloom. It was just his mind playing tricks, he told himself, weary from the journey, from the weight of his grief. This was what solitude did. It made the familiar unfamiliar, the empty full. He was determined to make this work, to find the peace he craved. The island's quiet was not the balm he had sought, and the unsettling, almost liquid quality of the silence that followed the driver's departure. Dean stood for a long moment, the wind whipping his hair across his face, tasting salt and something else, a faint, earthy tang that clung to the air like old rust. He shivered, pulling his jacket tighter, and turned towards the cottage. He spent the first hour simply existing within the cottage, its musty air a thick blanket. He unpacked little, just enough to feel he had some claim to the space, then found himself drawn to the large, drafty window overlooking the channel. The tide was out, much further than he remembered from his childhood visits, exposing a jagged skirt of black rock slick with seaweed. He watched, mesmerized, as the water, usually a relentless push and pull, now seemed to hesitate, drawing back with an almost reluctant sigh, then rushing forward with an unnatural, hungry surge that clawed at the shore before receding again. It wasn't the steady, predictable rhythm he knew. It was erratic, like a breath held too long, then exhaled too fast. A shiver traced its way down his spine. He dismissed it as an unfamiliarity with the island's unique currents, a cartographer's desire to impose order on something inherently wild. As twilight began to bleed across the sky, painting the clouds in bruised purples and grays, the wind picked up its mournful cry. It whistled through the cottage's ill-fitting frames, a constant keening sound that worked on his nerves. Then, within the drone, he began to hear it. Not distinct words, not yet, but a layered sound, like a chorus of low, guttural voices carried on the gale. He pressed his ear against the cold glass, straining to discern something, anything, intelligible. It sounded like a chant, deep and resonant, rising and falling with the wind's intensity. He shook his head, rubbing his temples. The isolation was already getting to him. His grief, his exhaustion, the sheer weight of being utterly alone. They were all conspiring to play tricks on his ears. It was just the wind, he told himself, howling through rock formations, creating peculiar acoustics. There was nothing more to it. Later, seeking a distraction, Dean began a desultory exploration of the cottage. His grandfather had been a man of few possessions, but they were dense with history. In a small, cramped study, tucked beneath a stack of nautical charts yellowed with age, Dean's fingers brushed against something hard and leather-bound. He pulled it out. The pages within were brittle, some fused together by what looked like dried salt water. The script was his grandfather's familiar, precise hand, but the words themselves were anything but. He flipped through the initial entries, which seemed mundane enough. Weather observations, notes on lighthouse maintenance. Then the tone shifted. The handwriting grew frantic, the lines slanting erratically across the page. There were sketches too, crude but disturbing. Swirling patterns that evoked deep-sea currents, amorphous shapes that hinted at something vast and unseen beneath the waves, and repeating symbols that looked like ancient, forgotten glyphs. Beneath this drawing, scrawled in thick, desperate strokes, were the words, "The deep song. It calls. It pulls. Don't listen." Dean stared at the page, his breath catching in his throat. What was this? The ramblings of an old man, alone too long on a desolate rock? He remembered his grandfather as stoic, practical, not prone to flights of fancy. Yet here it was, undeniable proof of a mind grappling with something profound and terrifying. He tried to rationalize it away. Perhaps his grandfather had been suffering from some form of dementia in his later years. The isolation of lighthouse keeping was known to take its toll. The sketches were just abstract art, the product of a lonely imagination. The deep song, a poetic metaphor for the sea's ceaseless roar, perhaps? He closed the journal, the damp leather cool against his palm, and placed it back on the desk. He needed to clear his head. He remembered seeing a small, sturdy building on the northern bluff when he arrived, the island's weather station. It was likely abandoned now, but its very existence suggested order, scientific observation, a counterpoint to the wild, irrational fears stirring within him. He pulled on his thickest coat and stepped outside. The wind immediately assaulted him, sharper now, carrying with it a heavier scent of brine and that strange, earthy tang. The moon, a sliver of bone, offered little light. They seemed to emanate from the very air around him, a low, insistent hum that vibrated in his chest. It wasn't the wind. It was something else. Something that felt like it was trying to seep into his thoughts, to unravel the carefully constructed walls of his sanity. He quickened his pace, his eyes fixed on the distant, squat silhouette of the weather station, a beacon of rationality in the growing, suffocating strangeness. He told himself it was just the island, the old house, his grief, playing tricks. The cold logic Dean usually applied to the contours of a map offered no solace against the unsettling scrawl of his grandfather's journal. He reread the last entry, tracing the faded ink with a fingertip. The deep remembers. The bargain is fragile. The words, once dismissed as the ramblings of an isolated mind, now resonated with a chilling weight. His grandfather, stoic and grounded, hadn't been prone to flights of fancy. Dean felt a determined urge to unravel this mystery, a drive born partly from grief, partly from an encroaching unease that had settled over the island like a permanent shroud. The cottage, despite its small size, held a lifetime of accumulated clutter. Dean began his search in earnest, sifting through stacks of old sea charts, weather-beaten navigational instruments, and boxes filled with forgotten correspondence. His fingers brushed against rough canvas, smooth glass, and the brittle edges of ancient paper. After hours of methodical searching, tucked away in a false bottom of a sea chest, he found it. A small, leather-bound collection of local island histories and maritime lore, its pages brittle with age and smelling faintly of salt and mildew. He carried the books to the sturdy wooden table, the same table where his grandfather had likely penned his increasingly desperate entries. The first few volumes detailed the island's early settlement, hardy fishing communities, and the relentless struggle against the unforgiving sea. But as Dean delved deeper, the narrative shifted. The text spoke of the dwellers of the deep, of ancient rites to appease the hungry void, and most unsettlingly, of a sunken city, whispered to exist beneath the perpetual twilight of the abyssal plain. Legends, the books called them. Superstition, the rational part of Dean's mind insisted. Yet a shiver traced its way down his spine. He pulled his grandfather's journal closer, flipping through the pages he'd already read, then pushing further into the later entries. With the context of the old lore, the fragmented sentences began to coalesce into a terrifying narrative. They came from below, one entry read, drawn by the weakening of the barrier. Another, even more cryptic. The offering was made, the pact renewed. The word pact appeared repeatedly, often underlined, sometimes with an accompanying sketch of a strange, multi-limbed creature, rudimentary but undeniably disturbing. What kind of pact? What kind of offering? And with whom? A sudden thought struck him. The weather station. His grandfather had served as a keeper there for years before retiring to the cottage. Perhaps there were old logs, observations, anything that might shed light on unusual phenomena. The weather station stood on the highest bluff, a squat, concrete structure battered by decades of gales. The windows were opaque with salt spray, and the metal door groaned on rusted hinges as Dean pushed it open. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of damp concrete and forgotten paper. Rows of dusty filing cabinets lined the walls. He found a ledger marked "Anomalous Observations, Restricted." His fingers trembled slightly as he opened it. The entries were meticulous, spanning decades, often in his grandfather's familiar hand. Most were mundane weather readings, but interspersed were notes that made his breath catch. Unusual seismic activity, deep tremor, no surface effect. Marine life exhibiting strange migratory patterns, profound disorientation. Low, resonant hum detected, source unknown, originating from below the waves. One entry, dated just weeks before his grandfather's disappearance, stood out. The luminescence has intensified. It is spreading. Dean's mind reeled. Luminescence? What was his grandfather talking about? Back at the cottage, the fading light outside seemed to leach the color from the room. Dean, exhausted, the weight of the discoveries pressing down on him, finally collapsed into bed. Sleep came fitfully, dragging him into a realm of vivid, disturbing dreams. Indistinct shapes, vast and ancient, swirled just beyond the periphery of his vision. He heard a low, throbbing hum that vibrated through his very bones, a sound that was both ancient and utterly alien. He felt a profound sense of being watched, assessed, by something immense and patient. He woke with a gasp, his body slick with sweat, the hum still echoing in his ears. The room was utterly black. As he moved towards the small kitchen, a faint, ethereal glow caught his eye. It pulsed gently, a soft, greenish light emanating from the corner of the room. Dean approached cautiously, his heart thrumming a frantic rhythm against his ribs. There, along the base of the stone wall where the mortar had cracked and crumbled, was a patch of algae. It wasn't a typical mossy green. This was a vibrant, otherworldly luminescence, throbbing with an inner light, casting an eerie glow on the rough-hewn stones. It seemed to pulse in time with the phantom hum still resonating in his mind. The impossibly bright algae growing indoors in a dry corner connected the dots, the journal entries, the ancient legends, the weather station logs, and now, this. The island's secret wasn't just history. It was alive. It was spreading. The deep remembers. He pushed the journal away, the wood scraping against the table a sharp counterpoint to the growing internal disquiet. The hum, at first, had been a phantom, a vibration in the ear, easily dismissed as the wind through a loose pane or the distant drone of the sea. But now it was undeniable. It wasn't loud, not a roar or a shriek, but a low, resonant frequency that seemed to bypass his ears entirely and settle directly in his sternum. A deep, persistent vibration that made his teeth ache. It felt ancient, vast, like the slow grind of continental plates or the pressure of unimaginable depths. Dean stood, needing to move, to break the spell of the sound. He walked to the small kitchen, running a hand over the cool, smooth surface of the counter. A ceramic mug, one he had left neatly inverted on the drying rack, now sat upright beside the sink, a faint ring of moisture beneath its base. He knew, with a certainty that prickled his scalp, that he had not touched it. He picked up the mug, his fingers brushing the residual dampness, then placed it back carefully on the rack. The hum intensified, a subtle pressure behind his eyes. For a fleeting instant, the image staring back was not his own. Then, as quickly as it appeared, the aberration vanished, leaving only his own pale, strained features. He blinked, rubbing at his temples, the phantom image clinging to the edges of his vision. Was he truly seeing things? Or was the light just playing tricks? He had to get out. He needed a clear head, a place where the air wasn't thick with this unseen presence. His grandfather's notes often referenced the weather station up on the island's highest point. A small, sturdy structure built into the rock, designed to withstand the fiercest gales. Perhaps there, amongst the old barometers and anemometers, he would find some answer, some tangible clue to what his grandfather had been so desperately trying to articulate in his final, cryptic entries. He grabbed his oilskin coat, the familiar weight a small comfort, and stepped out into the encroaching dusk. The fog had begun its nightly creep, tendrils slithering across the uneven ground, blurring the already indistinct path. The climb to the weather station was arduous, the path slick with sea spray and recent rain. When he finally reached the small, squat building, its gray stone blending almost seamlessly with the rock face, he fumbled with the rusted padlock. It gave with a groan, a sound that echoed unnaturally in the stillness. Inside, the air was stale, thick with the smell of dust and something else, something metallic and faintly briny. Old instruments lined the walls, their needles frozen in time. But it wasn't the instruments that drew his eye. There was a small, crudely carved wooden idol, smoothed by countless touches, its features indistinct, almost amoebic. His grandfather, the practical, stoic lighthouse keeper, had been engaged in some form of ritual. This wasn't just warding. It felt like an offering. His grandfather wasn't just trying to keep something out. He was trying to appease it. The bargain wasn't just fragile. It was active. As he stared at the grim tableau, the hum returned with a vengeance, vibrating through the very stone of the weather station. It pulsed, contracting and expanding, its edges indistinct, yet utterly present. Dean couldn't move. His muscles locked, his throat dry. It wasn't solid, yet it felt impossibly dense, its presence crushing. A sickening, sweet and sour stench, like rotting kelp and stagnant brine, filled his nostrils. He stumbled backward, knocking against the shelf, sending the idol and bones scattering to the floor. The sound, a sharp clatter, seemed to snap him out of the paralysis. With a guttural cry, more animal than human, he shoved past the encroaching form, his shoulder passing through its viscous non-substance. He burst out of the weather station, gasping, sucking in lungfuls of the raw, salty air. He didn't look back, didn't dare. The bargain was fragile, his grandfather had written, and Dean, now, was part of it. The deep remembers. He slammed the journal shut, the sound echoing in the silent cottage. This was madness. His grandfather, a man of routine and meticulous record-keeping, had simply succumbed to the isolation, spun fantastical tales to fill the void. Yet the journal felt too purposeful, too insistent in its madness. He opened it again, flipping back to earlier entries. They were less frenzied, more observational at first. Then the tone shifted. References to the hum, the calling, and increasingly, the payment. Dean's brow furrowed. Payment. For what? He saw crude, almost childish drawings interspersed with the text, undulating lines, swirling patterns, a repeating symbol that looked like a broken circle with jagged teeth. It was unsettling, not because of what it depicted, but because it was so utterly unlike anything his grandfather, a man who preferred precise schematics, would ever draw. A low thrum began to resonate in the room, not a sound he could pinpoint, but a pressure against his eardrums, a vibration in his teeth. He blinked, forcing the cottage's familiar contours back into focus. He was tired, that was all. The isolation was getting to him, just as it had his grandfather. His grandfather hadn't just observed the strange phenomena. He had reacted to it. The moon is full. The offering must be made. Offering? It wasn't just observation. It was involvement, an active role. His grandfather wasn't merely a witness to some strange natural occurrence. He was a participant in a ritual. The hum intensified, coalescing into something more defined, a low, guttural chant that seemed to rise from the very floorboards. It wasn't in English, or any language Dean recognized. He could almost feel the vibrations in his bones, a primal rhythm that urged something within him to respond, to yield. He clutched the journal, his knuckles white. Was this the deep song his grandfather had alluded to in earlier, more obscure passages? Driven by a desperate need to find some rational counterpoint, Dean decided to visit the old weather station. His grandfather had kept meticulous records there, charting wind speeds, barometric pressure, rainfall. The station itself was a squat stone building, a smaller, more utilitarian cousin to the lighthouse. Inside, the air was stale, smelling of dust and forgotten paper. Rows of charts hung on rusty clips. Instruments lay dormant on a long wooden bench. He found the familiar columns of numbers, the precise notations. But then, tucked between pages of barometric readings, he found more of his grandfather's scrawled symbols, identical to those in the journal. And beneath them, a series of dates, matching those of the offering entries. It wasn't just in the journal. It was here, interwoven with his grandfather's professional duties. The lines between scientific observation and ritualistic devotion were not just blurred. They were erased. He spun around, but there was nothing. Only the dusty shelves and the dull gleam of antique brass instruments. He was starting to unravel. He stumbled back to the lighthouse, the deep song a constant companion, a siren call from the black water. The journal lay open on the table where he'd left it. He reread the last few pages, searching for a clue, a way out of this deepening nightmare. And then he saw it. A rough sketch, almost hidden in the margin of a page describing the chamber below. It depicted the base of the lighthouse, with an arrow pointing to a section of stone. A hidden chamber. Below the lighthouse. He remembered the faint draft he'd sometimes felt near the spiral staircase, dismissed as a flaw in the old structure. Now it felt like a breath from an unseen maw. He descended the winding iron staircase, his hand trailing along the cold stone wall. At the very base, where the main structure met the bedrock, he began to search. His fingers traced the rough-hewn stones, seeking any irregularity. The deep song was a roar in his ears now, pressing against his skull, making his vision swim. His hand brushed against a section of stone that felt different, smoother, almost polished. He pushed, nothing. He pressed harder, feeling for a seam, a catch. The stone shifted slightly, revealing a hairline crack. Hope, or perhaps a desperate compulsion, surged through him. He found a small, almost invisible lever, camouflaged by years of grime. He pulled. The deep song swelled, a triumphantly dissonant chord that resonated deep within Dean's chest. This was it, the threshold. And whatever lay beyond, he knew, would irrevocably change everything. The spiral staircase, slick with the ocean's breath, continued its dizzying descent. Each step Dean took felt like a surrender, a deeper plunge into the island's cold, ancient heart. The air grew heavy, thick with the scent of brine and something else. A mineral tang, like wet stone exposed to forgotten light, overlaid with a faint metallic whisper that pricked at the back of his throat. His breath plumed in the frigid air, each exhalation a small, fading cloud of defiance. It absorbed the beam of his headlamp, reflecting little, like an eye that swallowed light. Ahead, a low archway, crudely carved, beckoned. He hesitated, listening. The rhythmic sigh of the ocean was muffled here, replaced by a low, resonant thrum that vibrated through the soles of his boots. It was a sound that felt less heard and more felt, a pressure in his bones. He stepped through the arch, his lamp cutting a hesitant arc through the Stygian black. It was the smell of something alive, but profoundly alien. His gaze swept the cavernous space until it snagged on the center. There, suspended in the air, a few feet above a pool of still black water, hung an object that defied description. It was not a rock, not a machine, not anything Dean had ever encountered. It was a multifaceted mass, roughly ovoid, pulsing with a faint internal luminescence. The light it emitted was not white or yellow, but a deep, shifting violet, like a bruise blooming from within. It seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting with the same low thrum that now vibrated through the entire chamber. A living heart beating in the island's core. This was no mere artifact. This was a gateway, a wound in reality. The water in the pool below began to ripple, not from wind or current, but from the resonance of the pulsating mass. He saw, or rather perceived, an endless, lightless ocean, deeper than any trench, vaster than any sky. Within it, colossal shapes drifted, not swimming, but existing. They were not creatures of flesh and blood as he understood it, but configurations of unimaginable mass and pressure, ancient beyond the reckoning of stars. He felt the sheer, crushing weight of eons, the slow, inexorable churn of primordial forces. The entity. This was its echo, its anchor. The island, the lighthouse, his own fragile life. They were less than motes of dust in its unfathomable awareness. Then the vision sharpened, coalescing around the island. He saw the familiar coastline, the jagged cliffs, the small cluster of houses, his own cottage. But they were all dissolving, melting. The ocean was not merely rising, it was consuming, not with waves, but with an oily black tendril that seeped over the land, transforming rock and soil into a viscous, unmaking sludge. He was being absorbed, not attacked, but merely integrated into its vast, uncaring existence. His breath caught in his throat, a gasp that tasted of salt and fear. He stumbled back, his hand flying to his chest, trying to quiet the frantic hammering of his heart against his ribs. This was not a monster he could fight with a lamp or a pickaxe. This was a force of nature, a primordial hunger that had merely been dormant, waiting for the right confluence of tides and time. His lamp beam, trembling in his grasp, fell upon a small alcove to his right. There, tucked away on a crude stone shelf, lay a collection of decaying documents, held together by a rusted clip. He snatched them, his fingers fumbling. They were old logbooks, weather charts, and faded handwritten notes, clearly belonging to a previous keeper. One page, thicker than the rest, was a meticulous diagram of the island, with strange symbols scrawled around the shoreline. And in the top right corner, a precise, hand-drawn sketch of the old weather station, its anemometer a ghostly blur against a stormy sky, encircled repeatedly in red ink. Next to it, a frantic, barely legible entry. The hum. It calls from below, the weather station. He'd dismissed the old structure as a relic, crumbling and forgotten. But a previous keeper had clearly seen something, heard something. The island wasn't just a place of solitude. It was a cage, and he, its latest unwitting prisoner, was now wide awake to the horror stirring in its heart. The entity wasn't just beneath the waves. It was here, pulsing, waiting, and it was reaching for him. A cold dread seeped into Dean's bones, colder than the island wind. The weather station. He felt a sudden, terrifying clarity. He stood inside the decaying structure, the wind whistling through the broken panes of glass, sounding less like air and more like a whispered chorus. The rusted anemometer outside spun erratically, not with the wind's rhythm, but with a frantic, stuttering energy, as if struggling against an invisible current. A low hum vibrated through the floorboards, a sound he hadn't noticed before. Or perhaps it hadn't been there, not like this. It was a resonant thrum, deep and ancient, felt more in his teeth than heard with his ears. His grandfather's journal entries, scrawled with growing desperation, flashed through his mind. The hum. It calls. It pulls. Then a flicker. Not of light, but of perception. The air around him seemed to thicken, to take on a viscous quality. He blinked, hard, and the familiar dilapidated interior snapped back into focus. You are already part of the deep. Dean gasped, stumbling back, his hand flying to his temple. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. He wasn't just observing the island's secret. He was becoming a target, a vessel. The solitude he'd craved had become a vulnerability. There had to be something more, a final clue, an instruction he'd overlooked. He turned and bolted from the weather station, the hum chasing him, a phantom weight on his back. The path back to the cottage, usually a familiar stretch of uneven earth and gorse, now felt alien, treacherous. The fog, which had been a comforting shroud, now pressed in, thick and suffocating, reducing visibility to mere feet. He could hear the ocean, a monstrous roar that seemed to come from all directions, no longer just the distant lighthouse. He ran, breath ragged, muscles burning, driven by the absolute certainty that if he stopped, if he even paused, the entity would claim him. He burst through the cottage door, slamming it shut and fumbling with the heavy bolt, his hands trembling so violently he almost dropped it. The small, familiar space offered little comfort. The air inside felt heavy, charged. The hum from the weather station seemed to have followed him, faint but persistent, a low vibration in the floorboards. He snatched the previous keeper's journal from the desk, his fingers tearing at the worn leather cover. He flipped through the brittle pages, ignoring the earlier mundane entries, skipping past the increasingly frantic observations about the fog and the strange occurrences. His eyes scanned the cramped script, looking for any mention of a solution, a countermeasure, anything beyond a chronicle of dissent. The pull grows. Dreams are not my own. The tide brings gifts, a voice in the deep. It speaks of return. Dean mumbled, his finger tracing the faded ink. Beneath the symbols, a fragmented entry, barely legible. Not a binding. A sealing requires a resonance, a mirror, a part of the self, a fragment of life, to turn the key, to close the gate, the heart of the storm, the anchor. Dean reread the words, his mind struggling to piece together the meaning. A resonance, a mirror. The previous keeper wasn't talking about a physical object. He was talking about a sacrifice. And not just any sacrifice. The heart of the storm, the anchor. A terrible, dawning understanding bloomed in Dean's mind, sickening him to his core. The entity fed on life, on consciousness, on the very essence of being. To seal it, to turn its own nature against it, would require something equally potent, something of immense personal value, an ultimate offering. A fragment of life. His own. He looked around the small cottage, the familiar object suddenly seeming fragile, meaningless. The hum grew louder, a deep, resonating chord that filled the space, vibrating through the very bones of the house. He felt the entity pressing against the walls of his mind again, a vast, hungry intelligence. It wasn't just trying to break through anymore. It was here. It was watching him, waiting, sensing his fear, sensing his desperation. The journal offered a way out, but the cost was everything. He was trapped, and the only key to his freedom was a terrible, unimaginable exchange. The island churned, a living nightmare rendered in shades of gray and bruised purple. The wind, when it tore across the land, did not merely howl. It shrieked with a sound like tearing fabric, carrying the scent of salt and something metallic, something like old, cold iron. The storm was not natural. It was a manifestation, a physical extension of the entity's growing hunger, its awareness now fully awake and reaching. Outside the cottage, the gnarled pines twisted like tormented figures, their needles rattling an incessant, maddening rhythm against the panes. He saw patches of the ground, usually firm and stony, now slick with a viscous, dark slime that seemed to pulse faintly, reflecting the gray sky in an oily sheen. The very stones of the path leading to the shore seemed to weep, their surfaces filmed with the same unsettling residue. The terrible understanding that had blossomed in his mind now rooted itself, solid and sickening. The journal, clutched in his trembling hand, had detailed the ancient pact, the sealing, and the desperate forgotten method of its renewal. It spoke of a counter-ritual, a turning of the entity's own nature against itself, an ultimate offering. He knew now what that offering must be. It wasn't an object, not a material possession. His memories of his lost family, the grief that had driven him to this desolate place, the very core of his identity. These were the things that held the most potent energy, the most profound personal value. It would be a dismantling of his own being, a deliberate erasure of the very experiences that grounded him. It was the only way. His gaze fell upon the faded ink of the final entries in the journal. The grandfather's hand had grown shaky, the words blurring, but the instructions were clear enough, if cryptic. A place where the sky met the water, a point of connection to the vastness beyond. But there was another place. The air in the cottage was growing frigid despite the smoldering embers in the hearth. He checked the old lantern, its glass yellowed with age, and lit the wick. The flame flickered wildly, dancing as if in a gale, even in the still air of the room. Dean ignored it. He stepped out into the maelstrom. The wind immediately tore at him, threatening to rip the lantern from his grasp. The ground was treacherous, the slime-coated rocks slick under his heavy boots. Overhead, the sky was a bruised purple-black, rent by flashes of sickly green lightning that illuminated the grotesque contortions of the island's landscape. The familiar path was gone, swallowed by shifting dunes of black grit and strange fibrous growths that pulsed with an internal luminescence. He pressed onward, his eyes fixed on the distant, faint outline of the old weather station. It stood on the highest, most exposed bluff, a skeletal structure of rusted metal and splintered wood, usually buffeted by the ordinary gales. Now it was a beacon of desperate hope, the only place left. He remembered his grandfather's scrawled notes, mentioning the station's unique position, its vulnerability to the elements, making it a perfect conduit. Or perhaps a perfect trap. The climb was grueling. The wind tried to push his back, to rip him from the face of the island. They seemed to writhe with a purpose, to grasp, to pull. He kicked at them and they dissolved, only to reform further ahead. The entity was fighting back, its psychic tendrils lashing out, trying to thwart his every step. It wanted him, wanted his consciousness, his essence. He reached the crest of the bluff, gasping, his muscles screaming in protest. The weather station loomed, a broken sentinel against the ravaged sky. Its anemometer spun wildly, not with the wind, but with a jerky, unnatural rhythm, like a broken toy. The door hung ajar, groaning on a single hinge, revealing a cavernous, desolate interior. He could feel it attempting to pry open the fragile doors of his mind, to consume his resolve before he could act. But he would not break. He clutched the journal, his knuckles white. He looked at the empty space in the center of the station. The perfect spot. The immense personal cost was a weight on his soul, but the alternative was far worse. He would pay it. He would make the offering. He would make. The wind, when it tore across the land, did not merely howl. It shrieked, a banshee's lament that clawed at the very fabric of the air. Dean braced himself against the gale, the salt spray lashing his face, sharp as glass shards. The island churned, a living nightmare rendered in shades of gray and bruised purple, the sky a roiling maw. Every gust threatened to tear him from the path, to hurl him into the churning abyss below. But Dean pushed forward, his resolve a brittle, unyielding thing against the storm's fury. He had come too far, lost too much to turn back now. His destination, the lighthouse, stood like a defiant sentinel against the encroaching chaos, its beam a desperate flickering pulse in the gloom. The path, usually a treacherous scramble, was now a liquid hellscape of slick rock and collapsing earth. He slipped, caught himself, his hands raw against the jagged stone. He could hear it now, not just the wind, but a deep, resonant thrumming that vibrated through his bones, a sound that seemed to emanate from the very core of the island, amplified by the churning ocean. It was the entity, fully roused, its presence an undeniable, suffocating weight. As he neared the summit, the remnants of the weather station came into view, a skeletal structure of twisted metal and shattered instruments, its anemometer a broken, useless claw pointing accusingly at the sky. He remembered the last reading he'd seen there, days ago, before the power failed. An impossible barometric drop, a precursor to this unnatural tempest. The station was a testament to humanity's futile attempts to measure the immeasurable, to quantify the unquantifiable. He didn't pause, didn't even glance at the broken equipment. There was no data to be gathered here, only pure, unadulterated dread. The lighthouse door, usually secured with heavy iron, hung ajar, groaning on a single hinge. Dean stepped inside, the wind slamming the door shut behind him with a thunderous boom that echoed up the spiraling staircase. The interior was a maelstrom of sound, the relentless shriek of the wind, the crash of waves against the base, and that omnipresent thrumming, now a deafening roar. He ascended, each step a deliberate act against the growing psychological onslaught. He saw his lost loved one, their face etched with concern, then with fear, then dissolving into the murky depths that now pressed in on him. This was the entity's true attack, not just physical destruction, but the unraveling of his very being. He reached the lamp room, the heart of the lighthouse. The air here was thick, luminous, charged with an impossible energy. And there, in the center of the room, was the manifestation. It wasn't a form, not truly. The air around it shimmered, distorting the very light, bending it into impossible angles. He had studied them, memorized them, even when his mind rebelled against their impossible implications. The ritual required a sacrifice, not of blood, but of essence, a severing. His cartography, his life's work, his passion, his very identity. Every line, every contour, every carefully rendered detail of the world, of his own internal landscape. This was the sacrifice. The entity had been feeding on his grief, yes, but also on his order, his attempts to map and understand a world that was inherently chaotic. He pulled from his satchel a rolled parchment, the last, most intricate map he had ever drawn, a detailed personal cartography of the island, interwoven with memories and emotional landmarks. It was his soul laid bare on paper. Consume the order you despise. He held the map aloft, its fine lines trembling in his grip. The entity recoiled, a subtle, almost imperceptible withdrawal, as if the very idea of order, even in sacrifice, was anathema to it. It lashed out then, not with tendrils or claws, but with pure psychological force. Visions of his loved one, screaming, drowning, clawed at his peripheral vision. He heard their voice, begging him to stop, telling him he was mad. His hands shook, the map threatening to slip. He saw himself, alone, adrift in an endless sea, his mind a blank, featureless expanse. This was the only way. To save the island, to save what little sanity he had left, he had to give up the very thing that defined him. With a guttural cry, Dean tore the map once, twice, then into a dozen ragged pieces. With each tear, a piece of him went with it. A memory of a specific vista, a technique he'd perfected, a sense of belonging to the ordered world. A profound emptiness bloomed in his chest, a vacuum where his identity as a cartographer had once resided. The overwhelming pressure in the room eased, just perceptibly. The light beam steadied, its rhythm once more a comforting, if still desperate, pulse. Dean felt a profound weariness, a bone-deep exhaustion that threatened to collapse him. He had done it. But the cost. The cost was immeasurable. The visions of his loved ones still clung to Dean's eyelids, tendrils of grief and regret coiling around his fragile composure. The entity had struck at the rawest nerve, aiming to shatter him not with force, but with unbearable sorrow. He swayed, the floorboards of the cottage groaning beneath him, the very air thick with the aftertaste of despair. But then, a flicker of the entity's earlier withdrawal, a subtle, almost imperceptible flinch from the map pierced through the haze of his anguish. Order. The idea of it. His fingers, slick with a cold sweat that wasn't his own, tightened around the parchment. This wasn't a weapon of destruction. It was a cage. His grandfather hadn't sought to obliterate the deep song, but to contain it, to chart its monstrous edges and thereby define its prison. Dean stared at the intricate network of lines, the cryptic symbols, the named currents that were more like veins on a living thing. He understood, with a chilling certainty that bypassed rational thought, that the map was a binding. He pressed the map against his chest, feeling the brittle paper crinkle, the delicate ink cool against his skin. A guttural sound, not from his own throat, vibrated through the floor. Dean felt his mind stretch, thin as spun glass, threatening to splinter. He didn't know what to do, not precisely. There was no incantation, no ritual phrase his grandfather had left behind. But there was the map, and there was his will. He focused, not on fighting the entity, but on reinforcing the lines, the boundaries. He imagined the ink flowing, not just on paper, but through the very fabric of the island, sinking into the bedrock, trailing through the kelp forests, descending into the crushing depths. He was tracing the contours of a prison, mentally, desperately. A profound shift occurred. It wasn't violent, not explosive, but a slow, arduous recalibration of reality. Dean gasped, his lungs burning, as if he'd been holding his breath for an eternity. He collapsed onto his knees, the map still clutched in his hand, feeling a profound exhaustion that went beyond physical fatigue. Something had been sealed, not just in the depths, but within him. He was no longer just Dean, the cartographer. He was something else, something tethered. He lay there for a long time, the only sound the distant rhythmic crash of waves against the shore. He pushed himself up, his limbs leaden. He needed clarity, needed to understand what he had done, what he had become. His gaze fell upon the small, isolated structure perched on the island's highest point, the weather station. A place of observation, of systematic record-keeping, of attempting to quantify the chaotic forces of nature. Perhaps there he would find answers. The walk was a blur of wind and mist. His boots crunched on gravel, the salt spray stinging his face, but he felt nothing, only a dull ache where his soul should be. The weather station stood stark against the gray sky, its anemometer spinning listlessly. A narrow desk was bolted to the wall, covered in charts and instruments. And beneath a stack of dusty logbooks, he found them. His grandfather's journals. They weren't merely weather records. Scrawled in the familiar spidery hand, amidst notations of wind speed and barometric pressure, were strange diagrams. Circles within circles, symbols mirroring those on the map, and long, rambling entries that spoke of the deep song, not as a metaphor, but as a living, breathing entity. There were observations of the sea's temper, the currents, the migrations of deep-sea creatures, all interpreted as signs of the entity's restlessness, its slow, inexorable stirring. Then, the reveal. A final, grim entry, dated just days before his grandfather's disappearance. The old binding weakens, the lines fray. It demands a new guardian, a new eye to hold the chart, a new mind to enforce the order. The price of its slumber is eternal vigilance. Dean have kept it. The map wasn't just a prison. It was a living, breathing covenant, constantly needing to be reinforced by a conscious will. And now, Dean had taken his place. The entity hadn't been destroyed. It had merely been reminded of its boundaries. Boundaries that now required his unwavering attention, his very essence to maintain. He looked out the station's window at the churning, gray expanse of the sea. It no longer looked like an escape route. It looked like a vast, patient maw, perpetually waiting. The fog began to roll in, a thick, cottony blanket that swallowed the horizon, then the shoreline, then the very base of the station. He was here, alone, forever tied to the island, to the map, to the silent, terrible pact. The deep song hummed, a low, constant vibration in the marrow of his bones. His sanity was intact, yes, but it was a sanity forged in the crucible of absolute horror, forever burdened by the knowledge of what lay beneath the waves, and his eternal role as its reluctant warden. He was free, perhaps, but only within the confines of a cage he now helped to build around the world.